Well, hello, my name is David Breland. I am the manager of Historic Resources for the city of Decatur, Alabama. We are in the Historic Decatur Depot, and today we have a wonderful History First talk, which will be given by Dr. Caroline Swope. Caroline has 3 degrees in the field of historic preservation, and we believe she's the only person in the entire state of Alabama that does have those credentials. She's going to give us a wonderful talk today on Preservation 101. So without further introduction, we'll turn it over to Caroline.
All right, we're going to get moving on this. So Historic Preservation 101. So as David mentioned, I'm the Historic Preservation Specialist for the city. My position started very, very late 2019, which meant 2020 when COVID made everything a mess, was sort of when I got going. So if some of you were like, well, we kind of thought there was someone, but we never saw them. Yeah, I had all kinds of great lectures and things, and then nothing happened in 2020, 21. So we're going to kind of go through, because I get lots of questions. I do serve as support for the commission and for the Architectural Review Board. I do a lot of grant writing for the city, do a lot of work with the National Association of Preservation Commissions as well. So I pulled this first slide in because I love this cartoon. We've got like 2 Godzillas going after a building, and one of them's like, no, not that one. We'll have the Historical Society after us. Don't touch that one. Because the question I get asked a lot, and I even got a phone call because, unfortunately for me, lots of people have my private number. So I was making dinner for my family last night, and I got a phone call from someone, work-related, and they were like, well, there's a house for sale, and the realtor said that they needed to talk to the Historical Society because they knew it was in the historic district. And I said, well, no, Historical Society doesn't have anything to do with overseeing the historical district. That's the city. It's a zoning overlay. So it's so there's a lot of, and that's not unique to Decatur. Lots of people are like, oh, it's a historic district, Historical Society. No, it's a zoning overlay. So we're going to get to that in a minute. There's a lot that we could do with historic preservation, and I sort of sat down and I went like 50 different directions when I started this PowerPoint in terms of what I get asked the most often and what I thought would be the most helpful. So some of the fun, pretty stuff I didn't put in because I'm trying to put in things to directly apply to our districts. So I'm kind of curious with the first one. I know y'all have seen these plaques before. You'll see them on houses. Does anyone know what it means to be on the National Register? Like, what does that mean? You've seen the plaque. Other than the fact you get a plaque, what does it mean if you own the building? Any ideas?
Regulations.
Regulations? On?
What you can do with the property.
It means 0 regulations on what you can do with the property.
Really?
It's a federal register. You could have a house on the National Register. You could tear it down the next day. You do not need permission from the feds.
Really?
Now, you might need permission from the building department or, the normal. So the first thought is, okay, well, God, that's such a government thing. How useless is it to have something that doesn't do anything? Well, it actually does do something, but it doesn't do what most people think it does. And we're going to talk about what that is and sort of why that's there. So the National Register was created in 1966. What most people are familiar with are either individual properties, so standalone houses, or historic districts. And there's a few other things, like you could have like a boat, but the things that most of us deal with in archaeological sites, what most people see are going to be standalone houses and historic districts. The plaque, when you go on the National Register, they don't even give you the plaque. If you want the plaque, you buy it yourself. So, I could literally have that plaque made because nobody checks it, and I could put it on my doghouse. No one's going to know. So, please do not. Years ago, we had someone go into Albany Historic District, and they did not realize they were under design review, and so I was called in, and they wanted to make some changes to their house, and we discussed it, and they said, well, but our real estate agent told us if we didn't have a plaque on our house, we weren't in the historic district and we didn't have to worry about it. And I was like, no, ma'am, the plaque doesn't mean anything. Well, we looked for a plaque. I'm like, I don't believe you. I was like, we might want to talk with your real estate agent because they may have misunderstood this. So These are nice. They're not always accurate, and you can have lots of buildings that are on the National Register. Don't even get one of these. My last house, I personally put it on the National Register, and I never got around to buying one of those because they're like $300, those little suckers, because they're big and heavy. So they're nice. But why do we sort of have preservation at a big level in this country, and where did it come from? Well, a lot of it had to do with Penn Station. It was gorgeous. It was absolutely gorgeous. But as you can imagine, by the 1960s, railroads were not in heavy use. And so the decision was made, they didn't need it anymore, and they were going to take it down. Well, now we look at it and you're like, that's nuts. Why would anyone do that? But it's a lot easier in hindsight to look at buildings than it is when you're in that era. Now we look at Victorians and say, oh my gosh, people should save them. 1950s, they weren't saving Victorians. They were taking them down. And so each generation sort of has its own blinders when it deals with things. There was a lot of public outcry, but ultimately the building was demolished. And this photograph, probably more than anything else, is one that really made an impression because this shows some of the best sculptural talent in the U.S. This is in a landfill. This is where it ended up. And so this photograph was on every newspaper in the country. This is where you could have picked up your Reader's Digest or your Life magazine. And it was sort of like, okay, yes, we're a young country, but we're not saving the best we've got. We're not saving things that talk about our history. What does this mean about us? So in this era is when there was a group put together in Congress. It was both parties worked together, the Raines Committee, and they wanted to go to Europe. They wanted to see how historic preservation worked in Europe. Because you have to remember, in the 60s, we're talking not that long after World War II. So Europe, some European countries are spending tremendous amount of money trying to recreate what had been bombed away. And so the U.S. becomes very curious about, well, how do you deal with historic preservation? So they hobbled together a national program. The National Register is one. Well, as you can imagine, anytime you have both parties together, they don't agree on everything. So they had these grandiose ideas on what they were going to do. So like if you've ever been to England, they do have protection over their historic resources, and they grade them, different grades, So maybe like A, B, C, I think there's like 1, 2, 3. They class them out, and different grades require different levels of care. And it doesn't matter if you own it personally, then that's your baby to take care of. The idea was in the U.S. that we might have something like that, but it never really manifested. There was a lot of discussion. So what they finally were able to agree on, this is also the era where you have interstates going through. If you've ever been through Birmingham, you know how like it just blows the middle of the city? A lot of these cities, you've got sort of just plowing right through the middle. People started to get a little bit upset, because these are some long-established neighborhoods and some old cities, and and of course, when you put an interstate through the middle of something, what's on both sides normally doesn't fare very well. It might be left standing, but it's not necessarily prime real estate unless you want to have an off-ramp with a McDonald's. And so that put people in sort of this, they were frustrated, and they said, okay, you're using our tax money. We don't need, this just happens. And so there was a lot of pressure put on Congress, and one of the things that did sort of float out of this was the National Register is designed to be part of what we now call Section 106, and that's shorthand because that's the federal code that it was listed under. So in my field, if you say you're doing 106, that means you are looking at federally funded projects that could impact these buildings. So the National Register, what that does is it's great and it's honorary and it tells you have something wonderful. But in terms of a protective overlay, where does that come into effect? If there's a federally funded project or if it's federally permitted. So like cell phone towers are federally permitted, but the cell phone companies. So is that worth anything? Because most private property owners, you don't have a federally funded project on your house, right? It is helpful. So, for example, about a year or so ago, email crossed my desk. They wanted to put a 200 cell foot tower, that grassy lot right there. So I want you to imagine walking out this door, 200 feet's a 20-story building. Right up the backside of Bank Street, right by this district. And doesn't mean we can stop it, but it means that I got to take one look at that and say, you're adjacent to 2 National Register districts. Do you think this is the most appropriate place to put your 200-foot tall cell phone tower? And then you start a discussion. You need to look somewhere else. Well, we can prove there's nowhere else for us to look. Okay, then maybe you could make it shorter. Could they make it shorter? Yes or no? It's a discussion. You get data back and forth. Well, this is as short as we can make it. Okay, well, we think it might have what we call adverse effect on the district. So we're going to talk mitigation. What is mitigation? It could be restoring a building. It could be putting up signage. It could be documentation. So the National Register does provide some protection in those cases. Some of you may have been to that meeting earlier this week on the proposed bridge. They're looking for widening a bridge, adding a new bridge, lots of possibilities across the river. That is using federal money, obviously. If it's going to be using federal money, they're going to go through a 106 process, and they'll be looking for historic sites, archaeological sites. I've been on 106 teams before. I was on one in the 90s in North Carolina. They were going to put an interstate bypass around Winston-Salem. And what did that look like? Well, they had 5 or 6 different routes. So this is long before the public is aware, because we're sort of starting to just set ideas down. So you have your map and you're like, okay, these are 5 different ways we could do this. And the engineers come back like, that's the cheapest. This is the strongest. And then the biologists go out, well, this one avoids the most wildlife. This is the best one for us. The archaeological people go out, okay, this is the one that avoids the most cemeteries. This is the one that has the least impact. They send out people that work in architectural history. Okay, this is the one that's going to plow through the least number of historic farmsteads. And then you cross your fingers and hope everybody manages to come on the same one. And if they don't, then you have to start. So that is a process that they will go through with this bridge. And that was part of what they were sort of discussing in that meeting, is sort of looking at, they're going to have multiple options. Which one, and no one is perfect, but which one's going to, be the best based on those things. So we've got this National Register that went through, but it obviously isn't going to save things. Not everything. It'll save some things, but not everything. So in Decatur, we do have some losses. And those were great buildings. We had sort of some industrial stuff. And can you imagine if some of these buildings were still, minus the alligator pit. I don't think we need the alligator pit, but the rest of it, it's kind of cool. And when I first saw that picture, I'm like, they kept alligators?
Yeah.
Really? So, do we know the names? Did they have names? They had to have names. Like Bob?
For the alligator?
Yeah, what did they name the alligators?
Snapper.
Yeah, I was just like,
Whitey.
yeah.
I'm actually
So-
surprised to find out we do have alligators around here.
Yeah, so,
Well, by the way, in my opinion, the biggest loss there was a 26 track turntable
yeah,
with a 26 bay roundhouse.
yeah, that would
Oh
have
my
been,
God.
So that was right
massive.
here on
That's
this
it.
property, yeah,
Well, this is 4th Avenue,
right,
between 4th Avenue
Yeah.
Southeast and Central Parkway Southwest.
wow. Love that house.
so
Great.
Decatur has sort of these fantastic historic districts, but they also have, and you know I'm going to get you in there, they're individual, the buildings. And a lot of people don't realize this, the city owns 5 National Register listed or within districts historic sites. So they're city owned. Old State Bank is one. This is one. We have the Carnegie. City owns the Princess.
Yeah.
And also the structures in Delano Park, the Armory, bathhouse, gazebo, Girl Scout Little House. They're fabulous. So the question I get asked a lot then is about, well, historic districts, because do we have a district? Am I in a district? What's a district? So we're first going to go a little bit in the history of Decatur, because y'all are confusing because you got 2 cities and then you change your names all over the time. It took me a while to sort of like piece this out. So Decatur, 1821. So this is the oldest sort of drawing we've got of that map when Decatur was first platted. So, and if you notice that vertical orange stripe over there on the left, that's Line Street. Line Street is literally the dividing line between Old Town and New Town, because they weren't that creative with their names. So, what is Old Town? Old Town is what is now part of 2 different National Register districts. Old Decatur, Old Town East, which is what we're in now, and Bank Street, Old Decatur. So if you look at this, we're right around here, right? Here's the railroad tracks. So this sort of, you can see, this is going right through the middle of, when they say Old Town, that's the original plat for the old city of Decatur, pre-Civil War. And then they added Newtown in 1836 when they were growing. So that's what Decatur looked like when it was first platted. We don't exactly know the boundary over here. We have some additions. So the boundary over here is somewhere in here. I'll be honest, it's going to take like 10 hours in the courthouse for me to dig through this, and I haven't had 10 hours to go dig through it to pull it out. But it's going to be somewhere down in here is that exact boundary. So that was the original sort of when Decatur was put in. Well, occupied during the Civil War. City was completely taken apart. We have 3 buildings left now that predate the Civil War. So after the war, they start rebuilding, but they also have a group of essentially carpetbaggers, what my great-grandmother would have called carpetbaggers and scallywags, that saw business opportunity. And the business opportunity they saw was Decatur's on the river. It has a railroad, it has river, it has road. It is in an area that is ripe for industry. So they decided to build what they called the Chicago of the South. And they platted an entirely new city. They bought about 5,000 acres for an entirely new city. They named it New Decatur because, again, not real original with our names yet. So just hold on. So we're in Old Decatur, which when it was platted, they called Old Town was what the first, when it started getting called. So lots of olds and news and Decaturs. So they have New Decatur. We now know that is Albany District. So if you're over there by Delano Park, this was an entirely separate city. They had their own post office, jail, courthouse. The jail was behind the Princess Theater. The first time I saw that on a map, I did a double take. I'm like, there was a jail behind the Princess? Well, the Princess wasn't the theater then. It was something else. So the park was a planned park. They brought in a landscape architect to design all of this. It didn't all get built. It never fails. When you look at a plan for a city, it never gets built the way it's supposed to. But they got portions of it built that way. And it was 1887 to 1889 is when all the pieces came together, and they have New Decatur. If you've ever wondered about the streets, they have alternating Confederate and Union names. That's why we have Jackson. We've also got Sherman. We've got Grant. We've got Lee. Challenge is the large majority of the residents coming into what they were calling New Decatur were from other states. They were Northerners. There started to be some tension. And part of it, the locals you built a city right next door, and then you basically say it's a new version. That's probably going to create a little bit of tension. So by 1916, there was enough tension between the two that the residents of New Decatur essentially said, fine, we're going to take our marbles and go home. And they renamed the city Albany because a number of them were from Albany, New York. That's where the Albany name comes from. By 1920s, the state was tired with all of us. And we needed a new bridge over the river. And both cities said, hey, we need a bridge. And the state said, yeah, you crazy up there, you need to merge. One city. We're not dealing with this. You have 2 downtowns exactly 2 blocks away from each other. Fix it. So they merged. When they merged, they took the name Decatur. But that's why we have, the first time I came here, this was like in 2003, and I was so lost. This is like pre-GPS on phones, so we have a giant map in the car, and we're out here looking at houses. And my husband's trying not to wreck because I'm in the front seat with the map spread out. And we come down Bank Street, and I love it. And then we go down Canal Street, and I find 5 houses I want. Well, it doesn't take that far from Canal Street to hit 2nd, right? So then we're on 2nd, and I'm like, wait, we're in a different town? No, we didn't. We didn't cross the river. There's a river, right? We crossed a river to get here. We didn't cross the river again. So I've got the map. I'm convinced I have it upside down because I'm notorious. And I'm just like, meanwhile, he's yelling at me that I'm going to make him wreck. I'm like, but this doesn't look like that. We're somewhere new, aren't we? Well, now I can kind of laugh about it. But at the time I was completely confused because the city does have 2 distinct commercial districts. And that is that residual sort of overlay between new and old.
North and south.
Yeah, I know. Don't even, and so it's really interesting. So keep that in mind because a little bit later when we talk about districts, you're going to wonder how they got certain names. That's why we get lots of Albanys and Olds and News and it, towns and Decaturs. It gets a little confusing. So for the National Register, we have 5 National Register districts. And remember, National Register is there to protect properties from adverse impact from federally funded or federally permitted projects. So for most people, unless you're managing to get money from the feds, it does not impact what you do. So what are our 5 districts? We have East Old Town here that was put on the register in 2012. We have West Old Town there that was also put on in 2012. We have Bank Street and Old Decatur. Originally it was just Bank Street, 1980, Bank Street alone. 1985 they expanded it to put the residential portion of the houses in, and then they changed the name to Bank Street hyphen Old Decatur. By the way, this makes my typing a mess anytime I have to do anything because I have to try to keep all these names straight. Then we have New Decatur, Albany. That is just the commercial. It is mostly 2nd Avenue. That was 1995 is when that was listed. And we have New Decatur, Albany Residential, which is 1983 was when they first did it. They came back in 2004. They updated it and enlarged the district. So these are our 5 National Register districts. Now, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, if Old Town is all of this, why are there different districts for what was essentially the original part of the city? A lot of it has to do with how old the nominations are, how they were prepared. Now there's pretty set professional standards, but back in the 70s and 80s, it was kind of a different world, and things kind of often they would have local volunteers work on them, so they didn't have the professional understandings of where to look for boundaries, how to set the boundaries for districts, what is important. And one thing that can really confuse people is they'll look for something like this, which is gorgeous. This is an internet picture. I have no clue where this is, but it looks pretty. So, fabulous. It's intact. It has what we call integrity. Integrity is, think of it as like a classic car. It's got most of its components there, and it shows that era really beautifully. People sometimes get confused because they'll see something like this and they think, oh, that's not register worthy. Well, actually, it's got pretty good integrity. There's a difference between integrity and condition. Because if you could see a classic car that you knew needed to be restored, but it had most of those parts, a good collector is going to say, okay, that's got something I can work with. Same thing here. This has most of its parts. But if you have a layperson doing this work, when this work maybe was done in the 70s and 80s, sometimes people miss that. And at that time, not everything within what we would now survey, probably, not everything was going to look as pristine as this. But this is integrity and condition. It's a good integrity, good condition.
Money.
Yeah. For those houses for Victorian, yeah, because they got more pieces, parts to rot off if you don't care for them.
Paint job would do wonders on
Yeah,
that.
well, this is going to need a little more than paint. It needs a roof on that turret, but I'm game. You got money? I'll do it.
Yeah.
But this has integrity, but it still needs some work because it has condition. Which does bring us to one benefit of the National Register. There is a historic tax credit. As a matter of fact, I handed y'all out these little green flyers. So, if a property is on the National Register, it is eligible to be reviewed for the historic tax credit. What is the historic tax credit? Well, it's designed for buildings that need a lot of work on them. You have to meet a certain threshold. You can't just say, oh, we're going to put a coat of paint on it. It's when it needs a higher percentage, and I don't remember off the top of my head. I want to say, is it 25% of the value of the building? But it needs some substantial work done. Maybe replacing electrical. Could be HVAC, could be plumbing, could be roof. These older buildings, they get to the point. All of the above. Foundation, extra money. This is when these buildings need work. So then you can be reviewed for eligibility. I don't have time to go into all the nuts and bolts of how the process works, but a building can also be considered eligible but not listed yet, because not every building that's eligible doesn't mean people have done all the paperwork. So I've gotten tax credits for some that then we have to file the paperwork after. So they're going to look at it to see if it meets the eligibility. So what do you get out of this? Well, it has to be an income producing building. It does not work if it's your private residence, but if you are renting it, if it is a commercial business, it is eligible. There's been talk of making one for private residences for years, but it's just never gotten off the ground, the federal government. So income producing, 20% of your rehab budget you will get a tax credit for. There is an upper end limit, but it's in the millions. I don't know what it is off the top of my head because I've never dealt with a project that's capped it. Those are for the things you have to remember. This program works whether you're in New York City, San Francisco, or here. So a project in New York City is probably going to have more dollar signs associated with it. That's why they do a percentage. But it means it goes through design review, which means you don't just get to say, "Oh, I have an old building. I'm going to fix it and you're going to give me money." They're like, you have an old building that is on the National Register and is a caretaker of that building to keep it in the appropriate condition. We know that to fix these old buildings costs more money. So we're going to help you. We're going to offset a percentage of it, 20%. But you have to meet certain professional standards. You don't just get to decide you're going to vinyl side it, shiplap it, paint it farmhouse gray. Like, those are kind of big no-nos. So there's review that goes through it. There's a team that reviews it. They decide, is what you have to tell them what you want to do. You don't get to say, "Oh, I fixed my house, I want money," or "I fixed my building, I fixed my building, I want money." They're like, "No, we need to be on the front end of that. It's not a retroactive program." And it does take time. And it's been around for a while. Like, the first one of these I did was like in 1993. And I think I found it. I should have saved it. I found a copy a couple years ago. It was handwritten. I was like, "Oh, wow. Okay, that's old." So to show you the types of things that could occur, like, most people, this is not here, it's elsewhere, but you look at that and you're like, that's a slip cover. That was hiding the original building, because in the 1960s, they thought this looked cool. So this is a project where they're getting federal funds to help restore this building.
So do they have to take it back to the original?
Each building gets reviewed separately in terms of what the requirements are, but in this case, they're taking the slip cover off. Yeah.
And because it's in the 60s, doesn't it have to be 50 years old to be considered historic?
Typically, 50 years is the mark, but there are exceptions.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the same building.
Oh, my Lord. have mercy.
So much better.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
That explains a little bit, and that's just like the tiniest piece of the National Register, but that kind of gives you an idea of what the National Register was in response to, what they maybe thought it might do versus politically the reality, what it can do and how it works. But the city of Decatur is what we call a certified local government. We call it CLG for short because saying certified local government over and over is a lot to keep saying, that we will do certain things. And what are those certain things that we promise we will do? Maintain a historic preservation commission. Check. We have one. Survey historic properties and or archaeological sites. Check. We do survey work. I'll tell you about some of that in a minute. Enforce state and local preservation laws. So that means if you have a state preservation law or a local preservation law, the commission's in charge of keeping up with it when they can. Review National Register nominations. If there are National Register nominations, we are given a courtesy round to review them if they're within our municipality. And provide a venue for public participation in historic preservation. That's why the commission meetings are open to the public. So that's a lot that we have to do. So then it's like, okay, well, if you're doing all that, there've got to be some benefits. What's the carrot? We get special grants from the federal government. We have access to a pot of money that you have to be a CLG to get access to. We get technical assistance from the state. That is a huge deal. I call Montgomery a lot. We have legal status as a consulting stakeholder in federally funded or permitted projects. So, for example, that cell phone tower. If we did not have that status, we would not have known about that until probably permits were filed. And at that point, horse is out the barn. So these are big benefits. So what have we done? Well, this year we have asked, it's too soon to know yet, but we asked for a grant to survey Austinville. We were kind of curious about Austinville. We know it was its own municipality at one point. It's a very interesting area of town. In the 1950s, it was brought into the city proper. So I found an old map of Austinville from the 50s, and then I had our GIS people sort of try to outline about where that is on this map. That's the overlay. So I'm like, okay, well, how many of these buildings here would have been around during there? We don't know yet. We've asked for funding to do this. We won't know for a couple more months. But this is one that we and why have we asked? Well, occasionally the phone rings and someone says, hey, I'd like a tax credit. Is my building eligible? Well, if we haven't surveyed it, it's very difficult for me to answer that question with any sort of authority. So the surveys really help determine, what do we have? What is it eligible for? We get money for other projects. Some of you may have seen about 2 years ago, we had the Designing Decatur booklets that went out. This was during the pandemic, so the outreach was a little different than what we had imagined. But we had a physical copy of the book designed for every fourth grader in the district. Literally, because I delivered them. My little car got loaded down. We delivered, the school district headquarters took them. And then because we were worried about kids having to go virtual, Downtown Redevelopment Authority gave us money. We got a pack of crayons for every kid, too. Every kid got a booklet and a pack of 24 crayons so they could go home and work through this. So it's designed to talk about, it was for the city's anniversary, 200 years, pick 20 of our most iconic sites. So everything from Delano Park to the wave pool, which is 50 years old. It's like the second oldest one in the U.S. That's a big deal. Bob Gibson's barbecue sign. That's a sweet 1950s sign. Even buildings people wouldn't have thought about, like the co-op headquarters. And then we had a coloring contest. You may have seen some of these around the Princess. We had over 100 kids enter. And then we had them write about why they picked their building. My favorite one, I would not have expected. We had a handful of kids that really liked the co-op. And there's one that's like rainbow colored. They're really cool. And one of them said that was their favorite building because that's where their grandparents met. Which was just like, and it kind of shows you like these buildings that maybe we don't always recognize because they're not a part of our life every day. They have really big meaning for other people and sort of how we move through that space. This is what happens when they look at putting a cell phone tower in, to give you an idea. So you've probably seen any sort of public, you see this, and you ignore the signs because they're just signs that say public announcements for things, and half the time they don't make sense to us. Well, this is one where we were told over by Westmead they were going to put in a 185-foot tall cell phone tower. And we were notified, and my first thought is, wow, that's really close to where we would like to do a survey. We think there's some 1960s era ranch houses over there, pretty good condition in terms of integrity. It's enough that maybe it could be a neighborhood. And remember, 106 comes into play even if it's not designated yet, but it has the ability to be designated. It meets the standards and it just hasn't been put on the list yet. So I picked up the phone and I called the state office and I said, hey, I've got some concerns. Let's talk about what we can do. And the state said, yeah, we agree. We don't know a lot about that area because you haven't surveyed it. I'm like, I know, we're asking for money, but we're not there yet. And they said, well, why don't we do a balloon test? And a balloon test is when they put a giant balloon and they float it up 185 feet in the sky so you can see how tall would that tower be. That dot there. So you imagine a tower attached to that, and if that was in your backyard. So then the question is, does that impact the historic aesthetic feel of that neighborhood? Probably. Yeah. So we have been negotiating. We now have that tower down to 125 feet. One really big thing that we're setting to announce next week, we received funding from the National Park Service to do a study on underrepresented communities to update existing National Register nominations. Because if you did a National Register nomination in 1980 and they say, okay, 50 years is the cutoff point. Well, subtract 50 from 80, what does that give you? 30. So that means it could not be any newer than about 1930 and be considered contributing. Well, except now we're in 2023. So now we're looking at buildings from 1973. Except nobody's gone in to do the research. So you can see these things they have the ability to go back in. It's like a doctor's note. I had a healthy doctor's note once, and it was a lot longer ago, and I don't get to pull out that same doctor note 30 years later and say, look, no, you got to go back in and get a new checkup. So every once in a while you get a new checkup, and things change, and the things that maybe were not important 30, 40 years ago are important now. So one thing the National Park Service has said is, hey, when we go through our records and we have all these older National Register nominations, we have very little on women. And we all know, like, women, they ran the churches. They did so much. The schools, the churches, the social groups. We've got, like, nothing in these nominations on the women. And we have almost nothing on the African American community, like whole portions. They're not in the record. We would like people to go in and start looking through the records. What can you tell us? So they said, hey, we will actually give grant money to cities that will help us update these records. So we secured a $62,000 grant, and it's a non-match grant, which means they're paying for the entire thing. And we're getting ready to start looking for consultants to do some work. So like Caroline Swope II, first female architect in the state, she did huge portions of Delano Park. We have like 2 sentences on her. There's more on her. It's just we've got to go dig it up. Some of it's at archives down in the south end of the state because I was down there digging a few months ago. We have Matthew Banks, second, if I remember correctly, second African-American council member in Decatur. Probably should have some information on him and where he lived and where he worked in the National Register District. We have Ava Stairs. She was a publisher. Her husband is the one that started what we think might be the first hospital in Decatur, the Cottage Home Infirmary. Yeah. So these are all stories that we've got pieces of the puzzle. We could get some more pieces in is what we're looking for because we want a better picture. So if you get more pieces in your puzzle, you're going to get a better picture on it. So that's something that we're working on. This is a slightly old picture, but this is the office from the State Historic Preservation Office. Here they're called the Alabama Historical Commission, but it is a state agency. I could start picking those people out. Like, okay, I called this person like 5 times last week. Like, we get their help, which is a big deal. So who do I call over there? There is someone in charge of federal tax credits. So anytime we have a federal tax credit. So I came here basically in 2020. In that amount of time, I have, if people use all of the ones I have earmarked for them, about $6 million in tax credits pulled. If people go through with the projects, that's a lot of resources. There is an Alabama state tax credit coordinator because basically the same process as the federal one, but it is competitive because they have a limited amount of money. Whereas the feds, if you're in, you're in. There's no limit. You just do the project. But they require photos and correspondence, and there's a lot of paperwork. And I love it every time I get one of these. This is part of the paper, Reduction in Paper Act of 19. I'm like, no, I haven't seen any paper reduced ever from you people. So it's a lot of paperwork because you're getting public funds. And if you're getting public funds, there'd better be a record of why you're getting public funds. Are you meeting the standards for that project? There is a survey coordinator. So anytime we do survey work, this is the person I call that says, hey, we're doing a survey. There is a National Register coordinator. So I talk to them quite a bit. There is a person in charge of working with CLGs. So if I want money, that's who I talk to. They really are fabulous to work with. We do have a commission. Now, there have been some changes in the last month, so some of this terminology might be a little bit new. We have your standard Historic Preservation Commission. I know in the past they did design review. They're not doing design review right now. We have a different group. I'll get to that in a minute. Hold that thought. So what's our commission made up of? We have 7 commissioners. 1 professional and an associated field. So the chair of the commission right now is John Allison, who's Morgan County archivist. It's a good person to have who's assisting with a commission. And then we have representatives from each council district in the city when possible. So we have representatives across the whole city. Now, why is it set up that way? Well, if we're looking at doing projects across the whole city, if we're looking at federal funding for projects everywhere, it's really helpful if I have people that live in those neighborhoods that I can pick up the phone and say, hey, do you have something we should be surveying? Is there a history we need to know about? What can we do to help? How do we work through this? All commissioners are required to train several hours a year per state requirements. And they 3-year terms, and they're staggered. So they sort of move through. So what does our commission do? Well, they help me look for grant possibilities. I don't know everything in this city. So and the only reason was Austinville, someone had mentioned Austinville to me and I had to go look it up because I've only been here about 3 years. So when you have commissioners in different neighborhoods, that's when it's really helpful. Phil Wiry is a commissioner. Phil has a thing for graveyards. I'm going to hear about graveyards from Phil. So he'll call me up and say, hey, we got a graveyard. I'm like, hold on, let me get my map. Where's the graveyard? So I had gotten some funding for one of the graveyards this year and I'm looking at funding for a second one. So they do public outreach. But now we have an architectural review board. And you thought, okay, now wait a minute. We used to just have a commission. What do these guys do? Well, the commission used to do architectural review in the district. So if you lived in Old Decatur or Albany and you want to make exterior changes to your house, they're the people that you take those requests to. They were so tired each month by the time we finished that when I would come into them with, I have a list of grants and projects, and they would just look at me and they want to go home. They just spent 2-3 hours. Imagine you're volunteering your time. And it's kind of like at church, because if you're not careful, you're on 8 different committees and you're doing way more than you thought you were going to be doing. And so I realized, like, okay, my commissioners, the way it had been set up, were just in one neighborhood, basically, 2 neighborhoods, not municipal wide. And by the time they finished design review, they just did not have any more time to donate. They were taxed out. And I said, okay, when I read our ordinance, we have the ability to have a commission that does the whole city, and then a board that just does design review. We've never done it that way, but it's been on the books since the 90s. Nashville does it that way. Some bigger cities will do it that way. And I said, you know what? I've got $160,000 in grants. I've got about $6 million in tax credits. I need some more manpower because the citizens need to be telling me where to be looking and what they want me to be doing. Let's open it up. So council in March, we went forward with the architectural review board. So that just does design review. That's all they do. It's just design review for the local districts. And they have 5 members. They have to have an architect because if you're working with buildings, they want a professional architect when possible. Materials specialists. Some of you know Bill Stone. Bill's awesome. He's our materials person. And we have representatives from Old Decatur and Albany historic districts because those are the 2 neighborhoods that go through design review. So you may occasionally see one of these around. I don't put them up for every project. Like roofing projects, they finish before I can even get out there with one of those. But if it's a bigger project that I think might go on for a while, I will put one of these up. That way my phone is less likely to ring constantly. So if you live in one of those 2 neighborhoods, the Architectural Review Board looks at our design review guidelines for the city. We have design review guidelines. We have had them since the 1990 was the first set. We're in the process of having them updated right now. We have hired a firm out of Nashville. We want one that has better pictures. We want one that talks about alternative materials, even solar, because sometimes people are looking at technology that wasn't around when they wrote the first set. So we're looking at including that. And I know people like to fuss because that's what we do. We fuss, but they have a 97% approval rate because I've tracked it for 3 years. So if they're submitting, and I guarantee you the 3% that aren't approved, most of them do a project and finish a project and they get flagged with a stop work order, and then they come in front of the commission and their project, they did the project out of order. And so they'll kind of go down a road and spend a lot of money and do something, and the commission's like, oh, that's not something that's typically appropriate for this district, and we're not going to approve it. You've got to change it. So
Picture down there.
this one. Oh, so it's architectural review guidelines are designed to prevent things like that from happening. So if you notice, you're not going to see a giant 6 to 8 foot fence in front of one of the houses in the historic district. It's not appropriate, right? You're not going to see what looks like something out of Star Wars being built on top of a building. Not appropriate. This is not. So this is where people get a little bit confused. So we have 2 locally zoned districts. So you've already heard about National Register. If you notice, National Register does not do design review. Local districts do. What is the legal mechanism that they work in? They are a zoning overlay. You find gold underneath your house. Do you get to put a strip mine in for gold?
No.
Not if you're not zoned. You don't get to put a poultry slaughtering plant there either if you're not zoned for it. Or a bar next to a school. There's zoning overlays, and zoning overlays control how properties can and can't be used. Historic Preservation District at the local level is a zoning overlay. In this, that's across the U.S. There's a few exceptions, but most municipalities, it is a zoning overlay. So we have 2 zoning overlays in this city. We have Old Decatur. It does not include Bank Street. It is residential only because their zoning overlay is single family. So every time I hear people fussing, you're putting in ugly stuff on Bank Street, where's the commission? I'm like, commission has no legal authority over Bank Street because that is commercial. Single family. And if your next thought is, oh, now, wait a minute, there's some apartments, they're grandfathered in But if you tried to build a brand new multifamily, it's not going to occur because the zoning says single family residential. Albany, and it's the blue on both of these, it's the blue. Local districts are designed to protect properties from adverse impact regardless of funding source. Doesn't matter who's paying for it. You, the feds. The feds can come in there. They got to play by the same rules everybody else does. If they bought a house and, I don't know, they wanted to fix the house for some reason, that's what they have to work with. So this is where people get confused. So again, this is the National Register District. See, Bank Street's in there. Here's the local. Bank Street's not in there. I need y'all to preach this one really loud for me. Here's Albany. Now ignore that as a separate district, but see? Now if you look at this real closely, you see how it drops below Delano Park and it crosses over here? Federal district. Does the local district go down there? No. It has different boundaries. So then your next question is, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Why would you have different boundaries for basically the same thing? And you're just going to confuse people. I don't make these rules, okay? So the reason they're different is when they put that zoning overlay in, most municipalities, the way this works is you have a group of citizens, and that's what happened here. They said, you know what? Our neighborhood's zoned multifamily. We don't appreciate that. We're trying to preserve these old family homes, and we have slum landlords coming in, chopping them up. We have buildings coming down. We have new stuff going up. The way we stop this is we want a historic district. And they go to council, and council says, yeah, which is normal. That's what happens in these cases. And so people come back, and they say, no, well, how do you get council to listen? In any city. Bodies, right? It's bodies. So people start showing up to meetings and they say, we really want this. And we don't know if we want to put restrictions on property. Okay, the people in this room want it. Yeah, but not everybody wants it. So most municipalities say, okay, we will look at a local overlay, but we need a certain percentage of people to say we want that. We're not going to just randomly pass something without knowing the majority of the people. The number varies. It's often right around 60%. So why do the neighborhoods have a different size in this? Well, the vast majority of the people down here said, no, thank you. We don't want it.
But they still could if they wanted to, that whole one
There is a
area.
process that they could go back in, but at this point they are not in it. So the vast majority, and same over here, and this is where it's interesting because my phone rang about 2-3 years ago and someone that was down in here somewhere said, we want in the district. And I said, okay, there's a process. What do your neighbors think about it? You know, they're no. And I said, okay, well, you need to know. You need to have critical mass because it needs to be, you know, so if you want that, it is a long process. It's not impossible. It is possible, but it's going to take the majority. And that's when that person was sharing, well, a lot of the property owners around me are absentee landlords. I'm like, well, absentee landlords typically don't like being held to high standards of property maintenance. So they probably are not going to vote in favor, even though they would be eligible for tax credits. But so that's why we have different boundaries. That is not uncommon. This is not unique, but people here will sometimes get a little bit confused over it because they're not as used to it.
So when you got a grandfathered in multifamily in a single, that as long, what changed at what point?
It can stay multifamily as long as it is used as multifamily. So for example, if they have a fire and they decide they're just going to let it sit because they don't want to work on it and they don't know what to do, and they let that building sit vacant for a year with nothing occurring in it, at that point the zoning reverts and they lose the ability to do multifamily and it goes back to single family.
So basically as long as they keep renting it.
As long as they keep renting it, yes. So I'll like the community that I grew up in, we did not do design review in our residential, but we did design review on our main street. And it's a Victorian era community, and there's that one neon sign. And it's big. It's 2-story. It's like, think Princess Marquis, but it is. So it's like cute Victorian, and then like light from heaven, just the whole thing. It's grandfathered in. It's probably never going anywhere. And it's at the point now where it's historic and people think it's kind of cool. But it's grandfathered. Now, if it, I don't know, lightning bolt hit it, it burned out, and they decided not to replace it. I don't know what the laws are in that municipality, but if they went long enough, they probably would say, okay, it's been too long, and you now go back to the current zoning. So what does the process look like if you live in a locally zoned district and you want to make changes to your house, your property? Well, you need what's called a certificate of approval. It's just, it's like when you go to the building department to get a permit. If you live in the historic district, you need an extra piece of paper. We call them COAs because trying to say it's our appropriateness, sometimes it's a certificate of appropriateness, and like trying to say that like 3 times fast is the mother of all tongue twisters. So we just say it's a COA. It's a review process for exterior work on residential properties in this district primarily, and you get 2 possible tracks. Because I know it was interesting, I was at a public meeting a couple months ago and people were like, it takes too long for the commission to review things. And I was like, well, when did you last have one reviewed? 10 years ago. It's changed a little bit in 10 years. So anything that is routine maintenance and minor work, when that paperwork comes in, I have the legal authority to look at it and review it and approve it. So I don't know, if I were to guess, maybe 75 to 80% of the stuff, like roofing, all the roofers contact me directly. Homeowners probably don't even know it's being done. The roofers immediately, because they have to get a permit. Building department will not issue a permit if they don't have that signed paperwork from me first. So that's fast, easy, it's a set of standards. But bigger things, an addition, changing out windows, changing materials, the full board is going to have to look at that. They meet once a month. It's no different than the planning board meets once a month. Paperwork is the same, it's just which route it goes. So, well, it fixes things. So imagine, this is in Oregon, this is not here, but this is a real case. You've all seen craftsman houses. They have a certain rhythm. Same house.
Oh my gosh.
So, clearly not in a historic overlay district.
Or they didn't get a permit and they
Yeah,
are.
so, and then, you know, we do not control paint color. Some districts do. Huntsville controls paint color. But in this city, what is controlled is, do you have a masonry building that you want to paint that has never been painted? Because masonry really should not be painted. There's a number of reasons why paint is not good for masonry. Masonry, water, it needs to breathe, otherwise it starts to damage. So imagine if that showed up one day. That one's in Texas. Yeah, that's real.
That's not Florida either.
No, that one's Texas.
Florida.
So
It might fit along the North Carolina coast.
yeah. So then you get asked a lot of questions about historic preservation and property values, and you know, if it's constricting what could occur to a property, how does that impact property values? It's interesting. A National Register designation or district doesn't typically do a whole lot for property value because there's no design review, right? And people might not like design review for themselves, but boy, they love it for their neighbors. What is the number of times the phone rings and I pick it up? The question I get: someone's doing work at, give me an address. Do they have a permit for this? You know, and it's always someone on the same block. It amazes me, or someone that walks through the neighborhood. So this one, yes, it's hugely fantastic for property values. They checked Savannah, Georgia. Non-historic neighborhoods, they were going up 108%, in the historic between 160 and 250 with review. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 45% in the non-historic neighborhoods, in the historic between 65 and 220 for local designation. Even Texas increased between 5 and 20% based on the city. The only one they ever found that did not work on that model was New York City proper, Manhattan, which makes sense. It's an island. It has a different, because it's an island, it's limited access, it's limited land. It impacts how that process works. But Ripkema is he's the international expert, and he is an economist. He's not a preservationist. He's a numbers guy, and he'll run them all day long. And he was like, it's a big deal. It caught his attention. So that's sort of like preservation in a nutshell. It should at least give you some basics that when you hear people saying, I can't believe they did this or they did that, well, they might not have authority over certain things. I want, people, we try very, very hard to work with the districts. We want them to look as wonderful as the residents do. And the residents that call that are concerned, we do everything. Now, if you're looking, and I can help you because I often get asked, well, there's a boat parked on the street or there's overgrown weeds in the yard. That's a different department. I will give you their phone number. But the Preservation Commission does not overview everything in the districts. They work with like big changes to landscaping in the houses. Those are, and the fences. Fences are a big one. So, any questions? There's a lot. Inside the district, our two districts have these big, gorgeous oaks and maples, and they have some age on them. And a lot of them are very big trees and very tiny planting strips that are very mature. So we have worked with the Historic Decatur Association. Some of you might be familiar with that name. Historic Decatur Association is a neighborhood nonprofit. They put on the Christmas tour. They put on the garden tour last week. They were very concerned about the trees, and so they have a pot of funding where they will pay for trees to go in, predominantly either in the planting strips or in the front yards. They're focused on the getting the streets shady and cool. And so we had a partnership formed between the Preservation Commission and them where they pay for the trees, and I worked with the city and arborists and horticulturalists to come up with an appropriate tree planting plan to get the right tree in the right spots. So we have trees that hopefully won't get too big. We have root barriers going in to make sure they're not buckling sidewalks, things that maybe hadn't occurred in the past that are sort of best practices now, because nobody wants to have a big gorgeous tree and then have to pull it because it's the tree that's too big for the spot. That's kind of, so they're working very much on that. We put out 20 trees this last year, and I've already started a list for this coming year that we're working on. So if you know people that live in the historic districts that would like trees in the front yards or on those planting strips, let me know. I drove the GIS team nuts because I said, hey, I need to know the width on every single planting strip in the historic districts. And there's this kind of long pause because I'm thinking, like, I'm not going out with a tape measure for 4 days. Y'all can pull it off your maps. And they're like, you need what? And I was like, yeah, pull up your little map. I was like, you see that little grassy strip between the sidewalk and the street? And they're like, yeah. I was like, I need the width. And they're like, oh, at this address? I was like, no, the entire district. So I have a master map that we created that shows, like, in this neighborhood it's 5 feet. This street it's 10 feet. Some streets have a lot. Some streets have very little, and that impacts what you can obviously put in there. So we worked really hard on that. We're very proud of that partnership, and it's a really great program.
Okay, I'll pass
Yeah.
it to them.
Any other questions?
As
It's
usual,
lunchtime. They got
as
food trucks
usual,
over on Bank Street.
Marvelous job.
Good.
ladies.
So thank you all.